Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first Monday Lunch Live for 2026. Now that the tennis is finished, the heat wave's finished, hopefully, we can get down to business. We've got a really busy session for you today with a range of fantastic speakers coming from a whole range of perspectives. We're just waiting for one more person to join, and hopefully they'll be sort the technical issue before we get underway. So welcome. I think we have about 120 people registered for this event, which is a fantastic response. I'd just like, before we get underway, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands throughout Victoria and recognise the traditional owners' continuing connections to the land, sky, waters and community. We pay our respects to elders past and present and are committed to honouring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and promoting reconciliation. And so we also will now give our appreciation, which is something for those of you not familiar with the VCCC Alliances that we introduced a year or so ago, where we integrate lived experience into everything we do. And that's because the collective and individual expertise of people with an experience of ill health and recovery is to be valued. We honour their courage and we see them as equal and active partners in health system transformation. My name is Melissa LeMessurier. I'm a director of the VCCC Alliance Board and have been the chair of the Cancer Consumer Advisory Committee for just over 3 years now. And it's a fantastic group of consumers who represent most of our 10 alliance partners, and they bring a wealth of experience as cancer consumers. With the session today, no doubt you've had a look at the introduction on the website, but we're here because we are celebrating World Cancer Day this year, and the theme is United by Unique, which really shaped how we approach this session today, because every person's cancer experience is shaped by their life circumstances, their identities, and their different support needs. And myself, that extends not only when I had bladder cancer, but to the needs of my extended family and balancing work. None of us are just a cancer patient or a cancer consumer. And likewise, the health professionals, the researchers, the educators, we all wear so many hats professionally and personally. And today, what we're trying to promote and talk about is how the cancer health system must respond to this diversity with understanding, flexibility, and equity. It's not a ticker box exercise where we want one of every type of person. That doesn't work. And we all have different attributes and experiences to bring to the party. So today you're going to hear from a range of experts, advocates, and people with lived experience to especially talk about how people who have cancer but also live with mental health challenges or a disability alongside that cancer diagnosis, and how we can intentionally improve the care that we give to that person. So we're going to discuss how we can work together across disciplines, across organisations, hopefully close that care gap and build a cancer system that works for everybody. Now, before we kick off, there's a few housekeeping notes. As you would have noticed and hopefully just heard, the event is being recorded and it will be available shortly on the VCCC Alliance Centre for Cancer Education. We've left some time at the end of the program for some Q&A, so please use the Zoom Q&A and chat function. If questions pop up during all the presentations, pop them in and we'll have a look at the end and get through as many as we can. I might combine a few. We often get a bit of duplication, so if you don't hear it word for word, hopefully you'll see your question reflected. Now, before I hand over to our fabulous presenters today, I'll just give you a very quick bio on each person, because they're going to have a rolling roster of talking to you and they'll introduce themselves, introduce the next person. So starting off, we'll have a person for anyone who's been around the VCCC Alliance or its partners for a while will know Mai, who is the Professor of Nursing in the Department of Nursing at the University of Melbourne. She's the lead for the VCCC Alliance Cancer Nursing Program and an Honorary Research Fellow in the Centre of Health Services Research in Cancer at Peter Mac. She's basically a legend in nursing. She's had an amazing career, but what I think she stands for and she's well recognised for is bringing equity of access to anybody affected by cancer and sharing her knowledge, collaboration, research, co-design. She's a person that brings people around her and also always seeks and leads for the best. Secondly, we have Louise, who's a lived experience leader. Louise is an experienced grief and bereavement counsellor and a mental health social worker specialising in Gestalt psychotherapy. She runs a private practice providing counselling to people who are bereaved, supports people with disabilities or those who have chronic or life-limiting illnesses. She also has lived experience of both disability and diagnoses of cancer. At 10 months old, her eyes were both removed, leaving her totally blind when it was discovered she had a cancer called retinoblastoma. Hope I got that right. Some 50 years later, she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and has been lucky enough to live through both, thank goodness. That's been 4.5 years since her last treatments. So she has an amazing insight into how the system works, both as a professional, but really in her lived experience leadership. And she's passionate about creating change and sharing those insights with her today. Next, we have Associate Professor George Disney. George is a Principal Research Fellow of the NDIS, Melbourne School of Population and Global Health. He's a social epidemiologist by profession, and his current research focuses on analysing the determinants of the avoidable, nice to mention that gap, in health between people and with and without disabilities. And some of that research he's going to share with us today is really informative to how we can help reduce the health inequalities of people with disability. He's an expert in health inequalities and passionate about improving the health of the whole population. And he's going to give us some great stats, which I think give us the head and the heart of the experiences and the data. Next, we have Professor Sarah Wilson, who's CEO of the Victorian Collaborative Centre for Mental Health and Wellbeing. Sarah is an international leading researcher in brain and mental health with a track record in research translation embedded in co-design with people with lived experience. She's a professor of clinical neuropsychology with more than 30 years experience in the Victorian public and private health sector and much experience in dealing with people with complex health conditions. A fantastic contribution to health science and social research and has been recognised by both the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences and the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. Also with us is Associate Professor Kathy Daniel, who's a consultation liaison psychiatry nurse at the Royal Melbourne Hospital and also representing Australian Catholic University. She has 35 years of mental health nursing experience and is Vice President of the Australian College of Mental Health Nurse and a director of various other committees and networks. Since 2003, she has been a consultant liaison psychiatry nurse at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, focusing on reducing restrictive interventions in acute health and ED and minimising harm. And she's really going to talk to us about where the service delivery around mental health, including cancer patients, is lived out in real life, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. We also have Alison Stanier with us, who's the Client Participation Manager for Scope Australia. She holds a Bachelor of Applied Science and Disability Studies and is an experienced professional with over 15 years experience in the sector. She has a background in case management and leadership, and she's committed to amplifying the voices and aspirations of people with a disability. So she'll bring in that fantastic perspective. Last but not least, we have Kate Barber, who's team lead for counselling at Cancer Council Victoria. She's worked there for 7 years, starting as a clinical nurse specialist on the 131120 information and support line. And she also has her own counselling private practice and believes strongly that psychological support should go hand in hand with treatment when somebody is impacted with cancer. So she is bringing a lot of fantastic frontline insight and professional specialist nursing. So I'm going to hand over now to Mai, and then they'll hand each to the presenters and the panelists. We will join you in about 30 to 40 minutes, and we'll have a panel discussion after that. Thank you, Mai.
Thank you, Melissa. Good afternoon, everybody. Melissa, thank you so much for that really generous introduction. It's an absolute privilege to be sharing this stage with you and all of my co-presenters. And my role really at the beginning of this session is to set the scene. We will hear from George and Louise and Alison about the detail and some of the data. So George, just to reassure you, I'm not delving into any of the data you'll be presenting, but really providing an overview of the importance of building inclusive cancer care systems. Thanks, Kat. To the next slide. So I want to start by acknowledging that actually at the heart of the Australian Cancer Plan is the desire to improve cancer outcomes for all Australians, and really thinking about that the imperative for the plan is to find and recognise people who have traditionally had real problems in accessing the system. Thanks, Kat. So we know that in Australia, we are very fortunate and have some of the best cancer survival statistics of anywhere in the world. But we also know that those statistics are not true for everyone. Thanks, Kat. So what we know here in Australia is that, as I say, we are really fortunate and have some remarkable statistics. But focusing on the World Cancer Day theme for us today around people with disabilities and people living with serious or complex mental health issues, the focus for us is thinking about what is happening to the people in our system and why is it important that we address this question about inclusivity. So these are a tiny proportion of the evidence that we're generating that is increasingly coming out in the evidence about why it is time to genuinely think about a transformation in the system of care so that it is truly inclusive of all people. George will talk to some more of this data, but we do know that for people with mental health issues and people with disability, that they have consistently poorer outcomes than many other people who have a cancer diagnosis. Thanks, Kat. So for us, really, it's recognising that, you know, when we think about uniqueness and complementarity, yes, of course, that we have to focus on each other as individuals, but there is a lot that we have in common. And one of the things that we have in common, of course, is that we all want fair access, affordability of treatment, fairness of treatment, and quality care. And when we think about the populations of people who've traditionally not done well in the system, we tend to think of minority groups, and yet look at this statistic. 1.3 billion people globally, that's almost 16% of the global population, have an experience of a disability. You know, we tend to think about ourselves in silos and put people in silos. But of course, these people who live with a disability have so much to teach us, also have cancer, have renal disease, have cardiac disease. And so the time of siloed healthcare really is at an end. And I really like this sentence here at the bottom of this WHO global report, that achieving health equity can only really be done if we seriously apply ourselves to the quest for an inclusive cancer care system. Thanks, Kat. And so similarly, when we think about some of the statistics and the outcomes that we'll hear from George and others about in terms of people with experience of disabilities, we know that similarly for people, and we'll hear this from Kathy and others, people who live with mental health conditions also carry a disproportionate burden of disease, that they carry a disproportionate burden of mortality in our system. And yet, you know, we know that almost a quarter of people who go in to have acute treatment actually have no significant benefit when they from that treatment after they're discharged. That's not about the lack of care in the acute setting. It is about that inclusivity of how we bring our systems together so that people truly have the opportunity to benefit. And there's some remarkable data in the National Report Card 2024. I'm not sure if the 2025 one is out yet. I haven't seen it, but I would really encourage you to have a look at that report. Thanks, Kat. So what do we know about barriers to inclusive care for persons with disabilities? And I include, of course, people with complex mental health conditions in that. We know that it's intersectional, it is complex, and it requires a whole of system response. So the factors that bring barriers to people to have equitable care and therefore equitable outcomes are structural. We have the social determinants of health, we have risk factors, and of course, we have health system factors. And in the next couple of slides, I really want to just focus today on the health system factors at a very high level, but just to sort of set the scene. We know that there are barriers to accessing care, whether that's through structural limitations, functional limitations, financial limitations. We know that there are limitations and barriers in terms of service delivery, health workforce, and I'll come back to the health workforce perhaps a bit towards the end, that there are limitations on data. We don't know who's in our system. We know little about the characteristics of people, whether they're social determinants of health or other more important determinants, like the nature of disabilities. And as with cancer, people who come with disabilities come with a range of disabilities in terms of severity and the types, and yet we use this sort of one term. So this notion around World Cancer Day of, being unified by our uniqueness is about recognizing that we all come as very different people to a system and therefore deserve nothing but a unique response to it. Thanks, Kat. So I want to talk about these health system factors broadly. Now, we know that our health system is complex, it is siloed, but the truth is we've known this for a long time. So the Australian Health Services Too Complex to Navigate report that said there'd been 16 reviews over the last 35 years that said, this is really messy, it's really challenging, it's challenging for everybody, but it's particularly challenging for some groups of people in the population. And of course, that includes people with disabilities and people with complex mental health issues. We've known for a long time that the system doesn't work for people, but it disproportionately doesn't work for people who bring additional complexities. That was published, that report in 2019. The Productivity Commission report that was published just at the end of the last year was saying the same thing. We need to really embed collaborative commissioning to increase the integration and the inclusivity of our care services. We've known all of this for a while. It really is time to do something about it. Kat, thanks. So what do we do? Well, one of the first things to recognise about this importance of inclusivity of cancer care systems is addressing health inequities for persons with disability benefits all of us, whether we're older, whether we're people with non-communicable diseases, migrants, refugees. There are entrenched barriers in the system, and if we can get the system to work for the people who bring the most challenging complexities, it will work for everybody. Sancha Aranda told me that many years ago. It's as true as it was when Sancha told me as it is now. We have to look to the people who are currently not serviced well and build an inclusive, integrated system that works for everybody. Thanks, Kat. And so how do we do it? Where do we start? So in these last 2 or 3 slides, I just want to give us a sort of high overview of, it feels overwhelming, it feels a huge problem, but actually there's a lot of information out there already to help us get going. And I think the first thing we need to do is have a really clear and shared definition of what we mean by an inclusive cancer care system. If we don't have a clarity of what the goal is that we're aiming for, how do we know we've arrived there? How do we know what data we need to collect? And I really like this definition by Inclusion WA that says that inclusivity is about creating a sense of belonging for everyone, recognizing everybody's value and the diversity of experience and expertise that they bring, and ensuring that everyone has equal access to opportunities and resources. There's some really strong KPIs in there that I think would make for a fantastic conversation, and I'm sure that this conversation will continue on. Kat, thanks. So the question is, where do we take that definition? Inclusivity for everyone, valuing of everybody. And in these last 2 slides, I just want to give us some pointers to say that we're already on our way. This global report, and again, I would really recommend you have a look at it if you haven't had a chance. The report on health equity for persons with disabilities in WHO. lists 40 action points of things that can be done. They're really broken down in a way that makes them accessible and allows us to think about what might be pragmatic projects around them. And they have 3 recommended principles for implementation of those action points. So obviously including health equity for persons with disabilities has to be at the centre of any health sector action going forward if we really want to see the reality of this. We have to ensure empowerment and meaningful participation of people with disabilities and their representative organisations when we think about implementing anything into the health sector. And we have to monitor and evaluate the extent to which actions lead to health equity for people with disabilities. And in this last slide, thanks, Kat, there is a really great publication out there by Cooper et al., published in Lancet Public Health in 24, that talks about the missing billion framework components for disability inclusive health systems. And I really like this. It breaks down again into aspects of good practice that are tangible and give us a way forward around system level barriers to inclusive cancer care and service level demand and supply. And the one thing I want to come back to as I finish is there are things here that are just do it, no brainers. So people with disabilities make their own decisions about healthcare and are aware of their rights and options. That is an absolute just do it. And we have the capacity, each and every one of us, when we interact with the health system, to ask those questions. Where is the voice of the people who matters most here? And how are we bringing it in? And I think the other piece for me, as somebody who sits in a university, is this stuff around healthcare workforce. Why are we not teaching awareness, knowledge and skills of caring well for people with disabilities, with mental health issues, who are homeless, all those other things that we know about? Why are we not making that the bedrock as we prepare the next generation of healthcare professionals? So I'll stop there, but thank you very much for your time. And I'm going to hand over to George.
Thanks very much, Mai, and such a brilliant presentation, and lots of common themes in your presentation that I will reiterate here, and really keen to hammer home some of those messages. I think it's a really kind of exciting time now to be working in this space. There is real momentum. Health equity is a key part of the cancer plan, and people with disability are explicitly mentioned in that. Also, I know this presentation isn't about the NDIS, but with the NDIS in Australia and the amount of investment that's going into inclusion for people with disability across the country, disability is a key focus of all levels of government in Australia, whether that be local, state, or federal government. So now's the time really to present the case for what we can do to reduce health inequalities for people with disability. So now on to the content of the presentation today, and it'll be a real brief presentation. First of all, I'd like to say that this work was led by Dr. Yi Yang, who's currently, she's away on well-deserved holiday. She worked over the Christmas period, she had the stat time off, but she worked throughout January and she's away now just for a short break. And this work summarizes some of the work we've done in looking at and estimating and monitoring health inequalities, in particular cancer inequalities experienced by people with a disability. Next slide, and then skip on again because that's just the usual copyright stuff. So in the presentation today, what I'll do is I'll talk about the work so far that we have done in our group about inequalities in cancer for people with disabilities. So the first step was to just do a review of all the global evidence, and I'll present some of the key findings there. And then the second step has been to establish some baseline data on cancer mortality inequalities in Australia. And for that part of the work, we used a really exciting new database. It's kind of not that new, but it's not been used that much and should be used more, from ABS, where lots of different data sets were linked together that allow us to conduct this kind of research for the first time. And in the second part of the presentation, we'll talk through where cancer places in terms of causes of death in Australia and how much of a contributor that is to inequalities in cancer mortality for people with disability. Okay, on to the next slide. And again, next slide. So this is just about the review of the global evidence. So on this slide, it's just a diagram that shows the summary of findings from our systematic review. A systematic review is a big review of all the evidence that's been published on a very specific research topic. So our review was about inequalities in cancer outcomes from screening diagnosis, treatment and care, case fatality, and mortality for people with disability in comparison to people without disability. And what we also did in the systematic review was not only just summarize what's been done out there, the research that's been done, but also the quality of the research. So it gives us an idea of where there's gaps in our knowledge and where we can move on next. So there's some key kind of messages that came out of our review and key things that we already know in the evidence. So in screening, people with disability are missing out on screening programs for a range of cancers, but in particular for breast, cervical, and bowel cancers. There was limited research conducted on lung cancer screening. In diagnosis, there's some research out there, and some of the studies, particularly for people with intellectual disability and something called psychosocial disability, which is people living with severe mental illness in general, found that people with disability tended to be diagnosed at a later stage. So cancer was more advanced at the point of diagnosis, but we found that the evidence was a bit patchy and more research is needed here to understand patterns of inequities for people with disability. We also found that people with disability receive poor quality treatment and care, often under and over treatment, and that's something that we need to understand better. And where there was pretty decent evidence globally is that cancer patients with disability are more likely to die than cancer patients without disability. And people with disability are more likely to die from cancer in general than the general population. If you want to read more, the references down the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please. So having found out the existing state of the art in the global literature, we went about establishing a baseline of measuring inequalities in cancer mortality for people with disability in comparison to those without in Australia. And to do that, we used something called PLIDA, the linked data set that I talked about previously. The measure of disability in PLIDA is whether people need assistance with core activities of daily living. It's a relatively blunt instrument in terms of establishing a population with disability, but it's a very good starting point. And one of the key advantages of the data that we used is that it includes the whole, in theory, includes the whole population of Australia in this study. Next slide, please. So on this slide, there's a graph that shows that cancer and CVD are the most important contributors for mortality inequalities for people with disability. So there's two panels to this graph for females on the left and males on the right. And it's showing how many more deaths there are in the disabled population in comparison to the population with people without disability. So a bar above the line, the bar that goes vertical, shows that there's more deaths among people with disability than people without disability. And we also split the graph up into 5-year age groups, with the youngest people on the left of the graph and the oldest people on the right of the graph. So now let's just zoom in on cancer, which is the green line. You can see that cancer contributes around about an additional, let's look at people aged about 50 to 54, an additional 300 deaths per 100,000 person years for females with disability. So it's a big contributor to mortality inequalities for people with disability. And it's around about similar to cardiovascular disease. So we're talking about one of the key contributors to death inequalities. It comes from cancer for both men and women with disability. Next slide, please. So just zooming in on cancer now, we decided to look at which cancers were the most important contributors to mortality inequalities for people with disability. And it's the same graph. So bars above the line show additional deaths in people with disability compared to people without disability. And we have the younger people over to the left of the graph and the older people over to the right of the graph. So for both men and women, lung cancer, which is kind of like the grey bluey color at the bottom of the graph, is quite a significant part of the overall additional deaths from cancer. So we know that lung cancer is highly preventable. So those additional deaths among people, men and women with disability, could be prevented. Colorectal cancer is also a key contributor to mortality, cancer mortality inequalities for people with disability. And for women, breast cancer is also a key contributor. So I think, you know, it shows the types of cancer that are contributing to mortality inequalities for people with disability. But echoing what May was talking about just before, we know what to do to prevent a lot of these deaths from cancer. So it's now's the time to really think about how we can design programs and prevention for people with disability and with people with disability that can prevent these additional deaths from cancer. Next slide, please. So in discussion in our group and from our research team and from engaging with people with disability, these are the kind of next steps that we've drawn out of the Australian Cancer Plan that we think could be important ways of addressing this big gap in health for people with disability. So co-design is really important. We need to hear from people with disability and work together as a whole community to design public health interventions that work for people with disability. As the systematic review showed, people with disability are less likely to take part in cancer screening programs. So that needs to be fixed. People with disability need to be meaningfully included in conversations about their own treatment and care. Diagnostic overshadowing needs to stop, and we need to address how we can improve best practice. And that starts with the education of health professionals at universities and throughout all of our practice. And support needs to be put in place and resourcing needs to be put in place to support health professionals to respond and understand the needs of people with disability in their day-to-day work. Next slide. And this is just some acknowledgements, acknowledging Yi again, the lead author, our co-authors, our colleagues at Cancer Council Victoria, and the funding for this work. Thanks very much.
Just handing over to Louise now. Thanks, Louise.
Thank you. And first, I'd like to thank the VCCC for including me and my lived experience for today's session. I think the title of this webinar is so apt, and as it's been shown in the presentations previously, because we need to be united in our attempts to be inclusive. And an important part of that goal is recognising the uniqueness of each individual. So I think it's fantastic that we're looking at these things. And I guess what I'm going to be doing is to bring it down to a more personal level. Next slide, please. In the beginning, I want to recognise the many strides which are already being taken towards recognising unique needs. And with the time I have available to me here, I can only touch on a couple of quick examples, I know, but I believe that there is a greater community understanding of some disabilities now and what supporting them looks like. We're making transport more accessible. We have guidelines which ensure that housing currently being built is more accessible to people with mobility issues. We're protected to some level by anti-discrimination legislation. There's increased access to Auslan, with classes available to the general community. We're finding now to widen its use. And we're developing specifically targeted programs for people who are neurodivergent. And something I can talk with greater authority about, obviously, is what this looks like for blind people and specifically what it's meant for my own cancer care. I think this first one is important, which is that information is now often available for download as PDF files. Small thing, but something very important, which often provides me with much of the same information as that given to my sighted counterparts. Searching the internet levels the playing field. It might take longer to listen to information being read, but if we want to do some deep research now, it is an option available to us. And further, if we're creative, we can have ChatGPT prepare regular updates for us about the latest research or symptom management tips. Facebook groups are a fantastic source of information. And although people passing on information through pictures can be frustrating, simple answers to questions from other survivors have been so informative to me. The range of apps being used by blind people nowadays is mind-boggling. So those photos that people send through to Facebook, which once would have excluded us, they can now be run through an app which will read the text to us. FaceTime allows us to show symptoms to a friend. Another app called Ira, which again employs trained human assistants in a FaceTime-like environment from the States, means that once inaccessible online forms, for example, can now be completed. Audible or local library apps have some of the latest books on offer, while apps like Amazon mean that we can independently purchase anything from sausage and gummies to continence products. Currently, I am on a drug trial at Peter MacCallum, and because their app for patients called Health Hub is accessible, this allows me to read clinical notes from my doctors, to check for next appointments, and so on. They're all things which add to my ability to be an independent woman managing her life with cancer, just as others do. An NDIS package is also a fantastic support for people with disabilities, making things like being transported to appointments possible, for example. So at some hospitals, where you are greeted by an electronic request to scan your Medicare card and then told to watch the screen for your name to come up next to a consultation room number, this would be impossible without sighted help. And what we need to recognise is that not everyone has informal sighted help available to them. If we could go to the next slide, please. Stories paint my picture here, I think, better than anything else I have. So I just want to draw your attention to 3 short ones from my experience. And in the first, I want to say that we didn't always get it wrong. So almost 56 years ago, as a baby with a rare form of eye cancer, there was certainly recognition of our family's uniqueness from health professionals. Things happened very quickly when I was diagnosed with retinoblastoma, and my eyes were removed in a matter of days in an effort to save me. As they sat in the waiting room just days after having raised concerns about my sight, Dad nudged Mum. A tray was going past with silver service on board. "Someone's getting bad news," he said to her. Moments later, the door to the same internal room opened and 2 doctors stood in the doorway. They then called my parents to come through. And my point here is that effort was made to see their needs and to recognise the enormity of their plight. By contrast, when I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer some 50 years later, a surgeon snapped curtains closed around my bed in a 4-bed ward while he told me in short, rapid-fire sentences that I likely had no more than 18 months to live. Along with his statistics, I was lucky, he said. I could have Whipples, the surgery that's available to some people with the disease. Well, as I listened, I had no real idea of what he was talking about. Sure, they'd be taking out most of the pancreas, the gallbladder, the duodenum. But what would it look like, I wondered? What did a pancreas look like? The opportunities to ask questions were few and far between, I'm afraid. Now, if we flash forward a couple of years, knowing that we're moving towards an understanding of palliative care being a lot more than just care for the last few weeks of life, I opted in to my local service 2 years ago. I sat with a nurse as she assessed my needs and dropped in some tips for me about symptom management. She asked me about my guide dogs, how many I'd had, and so on. "How do you get to work then, Louise?" she asked at one point. "Oh," I replied, "we used to walk the 3 kilometres, but now I sometimes am hit by waves of fatigue, and I don't want to fall asleep on my clients because I've used up all my energy. So more often than not, we take the train now." "Ah, yes, sensible," came her reply. "And on days when you're really fatigued, those are the days to take the car out. I know, parking can be a hassle, but at least you're less tired." I had to turn away in case I screamed with inappropriate laughter. But really, I was appalled. Was she not seeing me at all? Were her words so rehearsed that she didn't need to listen to what I was saying? And then there was my first experience of regular chemotherapy. Sure, I'd had a little oral chemo after my Whipples, but now they were bringing out the big guns. They needed to try and buy me time, as long-term survival was by now off the cards for me. On my first day of receiving this chemotherapy at one of our local private hospitals, apart from the fact that they were running 2.5 hours late, not something which tends to lower your anxiety, they also made it clear that they could not look outside the box on that first day. Firstly, they were appalled by my decision to bring a support person with me. Really? Why couldn't I arrive in a taxi? I only had to come up in the lift then, and I shouldn't need to worry about things like knowing how much time was left to go on my chemo treatment, or how to find the toilet, or getting a cup of instant coffee. When I then asked them what information on my chosen treatments was available electronically, they turned to a pamphlet rack. They begrudgingly agreed to scan in some documentation and email it to me, but clearly had no idea that a scanned image of a page, especially if it's not a good print copy, can be next to useless to a blind person. Next slide, please. So, with these stories in mind, I believe that the key to a more inclusive future lies in education. We need to be educating the community about the needs of people with disabilities and demystifying those needs as we go. We need to teach people, be they health professional, researcher, lecturer, or the students who will be health professionals of the future, to work with people to find ways to meet the unique needs of each person, not ever allowing them to feel like an imposition. We need to empower people, and in my opinion, doing that means challenging the them and us, which can spring up and put barriers in any health professional relationship. Having unique needs is something we can all relate to, really. So I think it means asking difficult questions, but also I want to hear less of the hushed tones that people suddenly develop when they talk about cancer or to people with cancer. Disability is no more a word to be skirted around than is death or cancer. So knowing that not everyone will agree with me about what we need, incorporating consumer feedback is critical, as is involving consumers wherever possible in aspects of training. Something I guess that George was saying. Of course, while these things might change our mindsets, there are also practical things that we can do, which for me would have been fantastic as a blind person. We need to check existing and new websites to ensure that they are accessible to those with screen reading software, so that level playing field of the internet is more of a reality than a dream. Each time an information package is handed to a consumer in person, the exact same package should be available as a text-based PDF, so that this can be emailed to people. For people with intellectual disability or more complex communication needs, to say nothing of people for whom English is a second language, separate resources in plain English which would make such a difference. Having plastic models available of things like organs which might be impacted by cancer, so that blind people are better able to picture what is going on in their bodies, is an easy step which could really help to clarify things. What we know is each person's disability is as unique as we all are. We therefore need to check in with people. We need to ask, what would be helpful to you? What do you need? Making formal supports available to people is also important. We can't assume that every person has family supports or strong friendship networks. What can we do to assist them? Is it possible that we develop volunteer roles so that if we flash back to my experience of day one at chemotherapy, for example, we could have volunteers there to take on the role of support people if someone doesn't have someone to bring? As I believe that connection is integral to us all, we need to grow connections, not to reduce them. We need to better publicise the networks that already exist and open up even more opportunity in the way of support groups and information exchange among people with cancer, giving them a voice and a chance to use it to express their unique needs. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. And I believe, if I've got this right, I'm now handing on to Sarah.
So, thanks, Louise.
Thanks so much, Louise, for such a powerful and poignant presentation, really bringing us to focus on all of the key things that we do need to do more work on. It was really terrific to hear from you. I'd like to thank the organisers for today. I'm really delighted to be here, and I feel like I'm a little bit of a curveball in this array of presenters coming from the mental health sector directly, and the newly formed Victorian Collaborative Centre for Mental Health and Wellbeing, the VCC, as opposed to the VCCC. You probably don't know very much about the Collaborative Centre, so I thought I would just give you a brief sense of who we are and why we have been established. Hopefully most of you are aware that there was a very large Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system that started before the pandemic and kind of finished during the pandemic, where we received an outpouring from the community, many people with lived experience of mental health challenges and their carers, pointing out fundamentally that our mental health system is broken and not working. So the Royal Commission laid out 72 key recommendations, and the first of those recommendations was to establish the Collaborative Centre and to start and do things differently. And all of those principles that you've heard so beautifully espoused in previous presentations were kind of captured in the recommendations that came from the Royal Commission. So the idea of the Collaborative Centre is to bring people together, that connection and those diverse perspectives, to bring the evidence, which wasn't getting into practice as fast as needed, as well as the experiences of consumers and carers in the system, the people actually using the system, to inform what we needed to do to improve it, and the clinical wisdom of practitioners and the workforce working together with policymakers to start and grow a learning mental health system, so that the evidence can then inform innovation and better ways of working. That can then drive new models of care, which we can test. Those that work then inform our workforce education and training. We evaluate that, and then we go around that iterative cycle of learning. And in that system, the government's established the Collaborative Centre as what they call a system steward. So that means that we have a focus on people who are actually delivering the care and coordinate that in partnership with the Department of Health and other mental health system stewards. So really system structures to drive this new way of working and change. That's part of our role, and to support the workforce to do that. Next slide, please. So our functions essentially are to drive transformation in the recommendations and the new requirements laid out by the Commission, to bring innovation and new ways of working, and then to see that actually land in practice so we get better outcomes for the people using the system. And so you can see we've kind of put our core functions together in this diagram on the left of the screen to produce this, overall system impact and a learning mental health system. So the system stewardship I've spoken about, and really our key role there is also championing the embedding of lived and living experience leadership into the redesign of the mental health system, so that, again, those pathways of care and processes of care actually capture the needs of people using the system, bringing the evidence and translating it so that it's implemented, upskilling workforce capability, And the government, you may not be aware, have produced a core capability framework for all mental health workforce. So it doesn't matter if you're a nurse or a psychiatrist, whoever sees you in the mental health system should have these shared core capabilities. The Royal Commission identified a postcode lottery that, the care that you got differed depending on where you lived. And this core capability framework is designed to address it. And so our workforce function at the Collaborative Centre is a whole of workforce function to upskill the entire mental health workforce, including the peer workforce. So this is the workforce of lived and living experience expertise, so that there is much greater consistency in these core capabilities. And relevant to this webinar today, one of those capabilities is holistic care. That is seeing the person as a whole and not thinking about them in terms of their specific disease or the organs that are affected, and then bringing a psychosocial framing to their care and making it intersectional so that it takes their psychosocial situation into account, but also their broader medical situation into account. And then ultimately, we do this work in connection and partnership across the state. So statewide partners and services, but also research organisations, the peak bodies for lived and living experience, and in partnership with government. Next slide, thanks. So in promoting this learning mental health system, you've heard already about equity, and the quintuple aim really is what guides our thinking in our work, and we've seen it and heard it already talked about today. But in the middle of this diagram on the right, which captures these 5 aspects of the quintuple aim, is to ultimately produce better outcomes for consumers and carers and uphold human rights. The Royal Commission found that there were many instances in our current system where people were subjected to harm and breach of human rights policies. And ultimately, we know we're improving when the people in the system start to tell us that the system is working better. And of course, equity of access is core to that. And we know, just like George has already described and Mike, that there is still inequity of access to the mental health system. So it's not just within cancer, but it's more broadly across mental health. And then what we need to do is upskill staff, and also we know support their wellbeing, because many staff tell us that, they're burnt out and they're not being supported by the system either. And undertake these changes in practice to bring these better overall system level outcomes, and to use our resources more efficiently and effectively to do so. Next slide, thanks. So here you'll see what our focus is in terms of our translational research function. And we are focusing on adults and older adults who need really ongoing and intensive forms of mental health and wellbeing care and support, and also supporting their families, carers, supporters and kin. We heard that there was just a lack of support for the carers of people in the system, despite them being core to people and their experiences of outcomes. So I guess that's the pointy end of care, a bit like we're talking about here today. And in the middle of those priority areas, you'll see intersectional care, and that includes people with other medical conditions like cancer, with disabilities, and from diverse communities. Next slide, thanks. So just a bit about me and what brought me to this webinar too, and I think this picks up on Louisa's beautiful presentation about the individual stories of people are what are often the most powerful teachers. I learnt about the lack of intersectionality of care. I've lived in the mental health system my whole life, but my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer that went on to progress, and I became her carer. And I went on that journey with her. And throughout that journey, I guess one of the main things I noticed was the wonderful people in the system who were all working really hard to support us, but also the variability in understanding of mental health and well-being throughout that journey. And in some parts of the system, we'd get really responsive and individually targeted care, and it would meet where we were at. And at other times we would feel very unheard. And, noting that I don't come with a disability. So that's, multiplied by a factor of an exponential value when you do. And what that really showed to me was the importance of bringing mental health care more centrally into the provision of cancer care, and that holistic lens of thinking about where is the person at on their journey in terms of their mental health and well-being. How is that being managed relative to their cancer treatment? And then coming up with a shared care plan that reflects that conversation and approach. We call that a relational approach to care, and that's certainly the model of care that we are promoting and innovating in the work we do at the Collaborative Centre, and something we'd love to work with the VCCC on to progress this for cancer. Thanks, I'll finish up there.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Thanks also to Mai, George and Louise. Fabulous presentations and a lot of food for thought there. We're going to now just have a quick panel discussion, and in the interest of time, short and sharp answers, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of room if there's any questions from the audience at the end. So I'm going to ask Louise first. You mentioned that an essential part of cancer care is seeing the person and not the disability, but also you can't ignore the disability. There's sort of two factors at play there. So how does that work in a clinical setting, and what you've given us a great example, what doesn't work? What would advice to someone on the front line? What would you like to see this play out?
I think really that, like I said in my presentation, I think if we can ask questions that clarify things for us about a person's disability and how it impacts their cancer care, if we can reduce the use of things like hushed tones as we do that, and stop prefacing every question we ask with only answer this if it makes you comfortable or such like, then we can get to the nitty-gritty of people's experiences. People will be uncomfortable. It goes with the territory. And to my way of thinking, that's okay. If we have an understanding of how disability affects someone's everyday life, which is built on fact rather than assumption, we can look together for creative solutions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Louise. Very wise words. Over to Kathy now. Kathy, you are at the pointy end, and you're working with nurses in the acute setting, supporting people who've had changes in their behaviour or mental ill health. Why is this role needed, and how does it intersect with other, I guess, either cancer or other conditions people are presenting with?
Thanks, Melissa. I think from a mental health nursing perspective, we have to realise that the undergraduate nursing courses don't actually have a specific mental health subject, and some nurses won't have a mental health placement before they'll actually care for people with a mental illness or mental ill health in a cancer or acute health setting. And the problem is there that they will have never worked with peer workers or the lived experience workforce. So I think education is a real issue, and I think that's where these roles play a pivotal role. And really we need to, education is the key, and best practice requires that sort of education and skilled workforce, particularly around issues such as diagnostic overshadowing, where we assume that illnesses or symptoms are related to the mental illness rather than actually the physical condition that's happening. So I think they're the main things.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, always curious that clinical education divides the mental health and the physical health, but not fighting that one. Now over to Alison. Can you talk us about when people present and they have intellectual disability or complex communication needs, what does informed decision and look like for them in cancer care, and how can we make the system more accessible and operationalise it?
I think probably, best practice approach is to enhance the ability of people with disability to make an informed decision and for themselves. And key to this is accessible communication. And as people have already talked about today, everyone is unique, everyone is different. And so I think a great starting point is simply having that conversation with the individual and potentially their support person where relevant, what works for them. And so I guess what I would say is take the time to ask about the person's preferred communication method. It's about, not assuming that if someone, don't make assumptions. Don't assume that if someone doesn't use speech as their primary mode of communication, that they can't understand what you're saying or that they can't take on the information that you're presenting. Many people use augmentative and alternative communication methods, which might be things like, communication aids or signs or gestures. So if you understand what that is, then you can really support them to participate fully. And as Lou's pointed out before, there's, it's also great to check in with the ways that you present information too. So people with intellectual disability benefit from easy read information, or as Louise said too, for her, it might be something like in a PDF format. I think the other thing that I just really wanted to make my point on is that make sure that you have time to provide the information in an accessible way to people. Make sure that you go at a pace that allows the person to take on the information. Wherever possible, give them information ahead of time. Many people really appreciate the ability to consider information at their own pace or with support and so forth. And just, if you're having a conversation with someone, take that time to slow down, pause, and allow that person to respond in the way that suits them best. There's a lot, I've just touched on a few little points here, but there's so much information out there, much more than what I can give you in this short space of time. So I'd really encourage people to also perhaps approach my organisation's scope or other advocacy organisations, because they have so much good information for people to tap into as well. So thanks.
Terrific. Thanks, Alison. So, Sarah, you in your presentation spoke about, approaching things at a system level. So what levers would most quickly improve cancer care, do you think, to be inclusive for people with mental health challenges, and how would you even measure that?
Yeah, they're great questions. Thanks, Melissa. I think from the view of the Collaborative Centre and our functions, workforce capability development is something that we can really target and are targeting. And one of the things that we are doing each month is spotlighting issues for mental health care. So, it would be very easy for us to do a spotlight on intersectional care for people also with cancer. And then we have an AI platform that's been developed to amplify and disseminate what are the latest evidence, toolkits, resources, knowledge, can be webinars, can be other kind of multimedia, to then support the workforce in then acquiring this knowledge and understanding. I think there's also a cultural shift, though, in encouraging people to start and think differently about how they approach people. And I think Louise's presentation just highlighted that beautifully, the questions that you ask and the way you approach it, and also what Alison has said. In terms of the measurement, traditionally measures of mental health systems have been in terms of bed stay and number of appointments and visits and the like. And we know that they don't come close to telling us how the system is working and whether it's doing what it's meant to be doing. So the government have recently, for mental health, released an outcomes performance framework. And this is really exciting because it's all about the outcomes of the people in the system and whether or not the system is working for them. So we're at the moment doing some research. We're developing these new consumer and carer focused outcome measures to bring in and put alongside these other measures, so we can begin to see, is all of this work that we're doing in terms of workforce training and development actually having the end point of better experiences for people in the system. but we've got a long way to go. So, the more that we can collectively come on board with this thinking, I think the better.
Yeah, fantastic. As they say, you can't manage what you can't measure. And I think the reference there to carers and loved ones who often walk alongside, whether it's a cancer journey or mental health or disability, is so important. Now, over to Kate from Cancer Council Victoria. What common presentations and needs do you see coming through your 13 11 20 number and counselling services? What are the best referral pathways and resources, especially for someone who may present with a question around their cancer treatment or a loved one, plus the disability or the mental health angle in addition?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. And, I'm listening to everybody's presentations today and thinking that it's great that everybody's on board with helping to increase this equity, which we are too at Cancer Council. We've got strategic priorities around equity to access. And like everybody said, the disability or the cancer doesn't go singularly, they're hand in hand. So someone presents with a cancer diagnosis as well as all the other life issues that they have come hand in hand with that. And that goes with carers and loved ones as well. So we certainly see a lot of people with pre-existing mental health conditions or various types of disabilities that come through our service. The wonderful thing about our service is that we do have, it's open for anybody. So anyone can call that 13 11 20 number and speak with our very experienced cancer nurses, and then we've got pathways to refer off to. So within our own organisation, counselling services, financial counselling, peer support, and also legal service as well. So we have that ability to be able to help people work out what is the best way for them to move forward. And the other part of it too, we're talking about, a few people have mentioned the importance of education, and our staff, our nurses and our counsellors, we're all very, very aware of disability resources that are available. We have often we have in-services and webinars from disability support services, so we know what they can offer our callers. And Cancer Council itself, we also have the easy English resources and the accessibility toolbar on the website. So when Louise was saying all of those things, I was saying, whew, we've got those. So I'm very happy about that people can go to our website and be able to access those. And of course, too, regionally, metro and rural, anyone can call us, which is wonderful. So yeah, it's that whole thing of the holistic person, as we're talking about, having time where they can talk. They're not feeling rushed when they call us. They have time to talk about whatever it is they need to, because I think one of the biggest things we hear is that people don't feel heard. And as we all know, working within the health environment, it can feel very rushed and people can feel very much like a number, like, everybody's been speaking about that holistic, knowing that that person is bringing all of the other things that are going on in their life and how we can best address those for them so that they do have equity of care.
Thanks, Kate. And that service is available for carers and loved ones as well?
Yeah,
So
anyone impacted
treatment?
by cancer. So it could be friends as well or work colleagues. So we certainly get a lot of calls from carers, and we're able to provide those same services that we do for anyone impacted by cancer and refer them on to the amazing suite of resources that we have.
Fantastic. And I think from yourself, from Kathy and Alison, we heard there are resources there and that assistance for anybody, whether they're the person with the condition or their loved one, to help navigate. And also, as we've heard, the health professionals themselves to access some of those tools that will, make that experience better for both parties. We're now going to we've only got a couple of questions in the Q&A chat. Maybe the panelists can put their hand up if they would like to answer. One from Bill Bennett, and it's it's not 100% on topic, but I guess what Bill's asking is what progress is being made to treat chronic fatigue and the impact on everyday tasks following cancer treatment. And maybe I might just extend that a little bit to think with a lot of cancer survivors, there are mental health factors that might have been underlying before or emerge during or after treatment, because there's a whole lot that happens up there as well as the physical treatment. So would anyone like to take that as a question on board? So really, what support is there for people physically and mentally following cancer treatment? Maybe I could throw back to you, Kate, just to give us a quick idea of some of the resources Cancer Council has.
Absolutely. And end of treatment is a huge thing for a lot of people, and we get a lot of people that come through our service that are struggling with a lot of different issues about end of treatment and all of the different things that come up at that time. There's certainly, I suppose from a very practical point of view, we've got information about managing fatigue and how that can work in terms of engaging, an exercise physiologist, dietitians, those sort of things, but also being able to talk through the worries and concerns, because like we've all very much highlighted today, everybody's experience is very unique. So knowing that once treatment ends, that's certainly not where the issues end, and there is support there through us, through counselling, financial counselling, because as we know, the cost of cancer doesn't just stop when the cancer treatment stops. It can be ongoing, and also through peer support, that sort of thing. Practicalities around the side effects that are ongoing as well, and how to manage those, because as most people with cancer that get to the end of treatment, they have that feeling of everyone saying, you should be so happy, you should be so, pleased that you're finished, but they're not feeling like that because of the side effects and other things that are still going on for them. So certainly encouraging a call to our 13 11 20 information and support line to be able to have a conversation around what supports are available once that treatment does finish, and life goes on but looks very differently for a lot of people.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks, Kate. And Maya, you had something to add on that?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add to what Kate was saying. I think that's really important around the component of exercise. Probably one of the most robust evidence bases we've seen being published in the cancer domain over the last sort of 5, if not 10 years, is about the value and the benefit of exercise. And I think to Bill's question, the real important thing is about asking about opportunities for exercise as part of your treatment early on, rather than feeling you have to wait until the end of treatment, because actually, we say exercise and people have images of people in the gym and pulling 200 kilos, it's really measured, tailored person exercise. And I think we have seen through large clinical trials that have been published last year that not only does the exercise improve your physical outcomes, it has significant benefits for mental well-being and actually for disease outcomes for some groups of patients as well. So I just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Yeah, great point. Thanks, Maya. Exercise is certainly the, before, during and after treatment now a central part of every cancer journey. The next question is a familiar name to many, Sanchia Aranda, Professor, who's chair of both the VCCC Alliance and of SCOPE. So she comes with fantastic wisdom and exposure to both these worlds. And she asks, what might be the key competencies we need to incorporate around disabilities in entry to practice programs? Who would like to take that one on?
Kathy, do you want to go, or do you want?
You want to go? Yeah, absolutely, Maya. If you,
Kathy, do you want to go first?
Kathy?
Oh, I think it's a really good question. I think there's probably definitely a lack of disability, knowledge and competencies in undergraduate programs, as there is for the mental health content. And I think that's really problematic. And I think that the amount of content which is put into nursing courses often doesn't prioritise the more challenging parts of nursing, and that is being prepared to care for people who do have a disability or a mental health concern or a health complexity that just requires sort of more, advanced practice decision making. And I think also having a workforce that is actually more prepared across the board, really. Yeah, back to you, Mai.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. And I think I'd just add to that, myself, it's such an important question, Sancha. I think, there's two things for me. One is, what we teach in our curriculum is about what we feel nurses need to know to stick a needle in somebody, or, and there, I don't mean to make like there are really critical parts that we need all of our nursing workforce and others to know to keep people safe in the system. But what we teach, I think, as our society's changed, doesn't reflect the nature of our society. That's both in what we teach, but also critically around the competencies in the workforce that we have. And I think, we talk about inclusivity and care for patients, but our health workforce has to reflect that same level of inclusivity and diversity, and we've got a long way to go with that.
Thanks, Mai. I've got one last question from the floor, and that's for George. What key indicators might we want to get into the National Cancer Indicators on Disability and Cancer?
Thanks for that question. It's really good. I think anything that can track progress against what we would expect to see. So in health equity research, I often say to people that you already see good practice or good outcomes within the population, and the key is tracking down where we've got avoidable gaps in health. So I'd be really keen for more thinking about where the gaps are avoidable and how they can be closed, and a clear way of measuring that using best practice. Sorry to get quite technical, but quite often we use relative measures. So how many times more likely people with disability are to die from cancer than people without disability, or other measures. They're not that useful. Really, what we should be using is absolute measures where we count the number of people or the number of lives that we could save, or the number of cancer cases that we could prevent. So I'd be really keen for the measures to be really equity focused, but also to use best practice to avoid misleading us on whether we're making progress or not.
Thanks, George. And I have one more late arriving question. It's a really good one from Peter. He said he's heard patients occasionally described as having complex and difficult needs. Do these labels really reveal more about the health services limitations than about the patient? Can't disagree with that. Who would like to take that one on?
I'm happy to just provide a comment, Melissa.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it actually really leads into stigma, and the labels and the terminology that we actually use. Like, who wants to be called difficult or complex? We actually need to name it as such, name exactly what we're doing. But I'll be interested to hear what Louise says also.
Yes, I think that's absolutely on the number. Really, Peter, that people are phased by disability, by cancer, by, like I was saying before, about our need to get the wording right, and to say things in a way that doesn't offend. And I'm glad to note that today we've had several people mention that cancer and disability are just one part of people's lives. I'm so passionate about us seeing this that I'm currently writing a book about my lived experience as both a cancer patient and a health professional or counsellor, which is called Help Us to Live While We Die. And I think I do that because I believe this is a huge gap in our service provision. We need to be able to talk about what's working for us, talk about what's not working, and on a level playing field.
Absolutely, Louise. I think it's asking the open-ended questions and listening to the answers. And if you don't fit in any box, along with the words that Peter mentioned, complex and difficult, I hate the word non-compliant applied to patients, like naughty patient, without maybe not asking or inquiring about what's preventing them to undertake a part of a treatment or travel to a hospital, clinic, or whatever. So yeah, language is very, very important. Now we're in the home stretch. We've heard a lot of information. I'm sure everyone online, I hope, has got some thoughts bubbling around. We've heard from different aspects of cancer care and disability and intellectual disability, mental health. Lots in that pot. So I'm going to give you a 30-second each moment just to say what's your one take-home message to the audience. I'll start with Sarah.
Sorry, slow on my button press. I think to come back to holistic care and less thinking about the organs or the parts of the person and more thinking about the whole person. Yeah.
Perfect. George.
I agree with that from Sarah, definitely. And sometimes when you're talking about numbers, it can feel like you're reducing people down to stats. But what I would say is that it's really keen for us to start thinking through how much of the cancer gap is avoidable and start prioritizing areas where we can close the gap as quickly as possible.
Thank you, George. Kathy.
I think we need to assume people have capacity rather than assuming they don't.
100%. Don't look at the deficits. Alison.
Thanks. And sort of going on from what Kathy's saying too, I'd say don't assume. Ask the individual themselves what they're after, what works for them, and you'll find out so much. And I think work well together. So yeah.
Thank you. Louise.
I think we need to remember that generally people won't break if they're asked a question that they find intrusive. I think that we all need to work together, people with disabilities, with mental health issues, health professionals, and so on. And we need to value uniqueness and yet not necessarily see it as remarkable, just something that we find ways of including.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Maya, I think that's your lucky last.
Yeah, look, I think it's always difficult to come after Louise. Thank you, Louise. I think for me, it's, recognizing that we have a plethora of care professionals out there who come to work every day to do the very best that they can do in the really constrained resources. And asking people to ask themselves, what can I do for the individual in front of me that might make this experience better for them, rather than, there's so much to do. It's going to take a whole system and a whole political system, large P and small P levels, for us to get an inclusive cancer care system. But I think if we ask ourselves, for this person who's sitting in front of me with their family, whoever it may be, their carers, what can I do to make this experience more tolerable for them? Then I think that'll go a long way to shifting things forward.
Thank you. Who did I miss? Did I miss one person? We all got there? Good. Excellent. Well, look, we are about to close. I would just like everyone to give a virtual hands clap and say thank you to all our wonderful panelists. What an amazing perspective of views there. So thanks everybody for your contribution today and for what you do in your professional and in your caring roles, because it makes all the difference. Just a reminder, as you see on screen, that today's webinar was recorded and you'll be able to watch back in a few weeks the wisdom that you've heard today and have a look at any of those references and for things you'd like to follow up. Also, I'd like to do a promo for the next webinar, which is the Monday Lunch Live and Recap Journal Club. And it's about the impact of a nurse navigator geriatric oncology model with 3 fantastic presenters. And that's next Monday, February 9th, from a special time of 2 till 3. So we hope to see you all there. And thank you for everybody who's joined today. It was a really fantastic event, and I think it goes a long way to realizing that we're all human beings and we all come with lots of hats and lots of wisdom, no matter whether we got it out of a book, on the trench, in the trench, or caring for a loved one. So if the cancer world is full of people like we've had on the webinar today, we're in very good hands. So thanks very much, everybody, and have a great afternoon.